is saying the information they've been given shows no connection between Brian Kohberger and the victims. As a defense attorney, your thoughts on their claim?
Well, they're going to have to back them up at trial. If they're claiming there's no connection, there have been cell tower pings which are not conclusive in themselves. Then, yeah, his touch DNA was found on the knife sheath. That can be addressed too by the fact that touch DNA can be transferred by more than just the perpetrator touching the item in question. For example, if I shake hands with you and then go kill somebody, your DNA will be on the murder weapon. But you also have alleged messages on Instagram and some of the months leading up to this incident from Brian Kohberger to one of the victims. Now, obviously, that's stuff that if the prosecution's alleging the stuff, they're going to have to back that up. So, yeah, there's a pretty interesting mix of evidence and arguments here.
And I want to be clear about this whole thing about the Instagram messages. That was reported by one news outlet, and we haven't been able to verify that. We don't even know if that's true. That was one news outlet that reported that information, citing an anonymous source. There's been a lot of anonymous source information in this case, so we have to be really careful about that. But what I find interesting about it is that, yeah, what I find interesting about it is they're saying there's no connection. Then we move on to the DNA part. Interesting about it is they're saying there's no connection. Then we move on to the DNA part. About it is they're saying there's no connection. Then we move on to the DNA part of this. The DNA part is them saying that what I find interesting, they're saying there's no DNA of the victims, and this is a crime that would have been incredibly bloody. We have 4 college students stabbed to death in a home. One of them, we know, Xana Kernodle, according to her father, fought back. So there was some type of altercation there with a knife. And yet the defense team is saying in this filing that there wasn't any of the victims' DNA in this case found in Brian Kohberger's home, his office, his apartment, or his vehicle that the state says he was driving that night of the homicide. So would you expect, after a crime that is so bloody, it had to have been, that there would be no evidence of their victim's DNA in this vehicle?
That's actually very shocking if you're on the prosecution side of this. Yeah, that certainly helps the defense. Now, if there happens to be some evidence that he did some complete deep cleaning, that's one thing that could possibly mitigate that for the prosecution. But on its face, yeah, it definitely doesn't help the prosecution if there's really is no DNA from the victims in either Mr. Kohberger's car or at his home.
And we did, as I mentioned earlier, up at the top of this, we had been given information I had back in January that he may have bleached this car. That hasn't come up in any court filings yet, but that is something I was told from somebody I consider reliable. Another thing that I find interesting about all of this is the fact that the defense, they've received 51 terabytes of information from the prosecution. That includes video evidence, reports. They obviously have some DNA evidence, some DNA testing results back from the crime lab. They've been given that information, but they're saying the state is still trying to hide its case from them. And they're talking about the genetic genealogy that was used to identify a suspect in this case from that touch DNA that was found on the knife sheath laying next to Maddie Mogen's body. They cited a case, the Green case, where they said, oh, look at this other case. In that case, the prosecution wasn't required to turn over the genetic genealogy information to the defense, so we shouldn't have to do it either. What is your take on that? Because I find that confounding, that you would not have to, as the prosecution, you wouldn't be required to turn over evidence that led you to a suspect, and you're citing all this information, but you wouldn't turn it over to the defense so they could defend their client.
I think that's the fox guarding the hen house, expecting the judge to trust him. When the fox guarding the hen house says, trust me, you don't have to check on the hens. That definitely is what I'm thinking we have here by the state. Now, the defense cites a case of their own where they use the methodology from a facial recognition software, where another court found that that had to be disclosed, and saying it shouldn't be disclosed to the defense to protect all those innocent people in the database and so on. That is completely going over the top. If they really feel the need to get have those people protected, it can easily be done with a protective order where only counsel is allowed to view it.
Wondering too, why wouldn't you just say only counsel can view this information, but we're going to turn it over? Why do you think that the prosecution is so loath to turn this over, James? Because I would think that this would be pretty discoverable. This would be kind of like exhibit A of discovery that should be turned over. This is how you found our guy. This is how you determined or figured out or tried to find out that my client was the suspect. So why would they not want that information turned over? I understand they're saying, oh, we want to protect the identity of all these other relatives, but doesn't that seem like something that should be turned over?
It does. And again, that's where I use my fox guarding the henhouse analogy. They're basically saying, trust the fox who's guarding the henhouse to say he's not going after the hens without checking on the hens yourself. And even just real basic. Remember when we did math class when we were going up in school, it was always show your work. You don't just give an answer. And that's another analogy I'll use here. How did they get to that conclusion? The state definitely needs to turn that over so the defense can adequately investigate that. Given that this is a death penalty case, if the judge doesn't let the defense look at that stuff, he's asking for reversal on appeal.
There were two other interesting items included in the defense's kind of response to the state's motion for a protective order, in which they said there were two other male DNA profiles that the prosecution, the police, had run through CODIS, the DNA index system that tracks known felons. So it was two other male profiles found in the home, then a third male DNA profile found on a glove outside the home. What is that telling you? If they ran these through CODIS, would those profiles be profiles they just couldn't identify from other people that had been in the house? Or are these DNA profiles that are on items of evidence that could be noteworthy?
That depends. I mean, it depends on who these people are and how their locations can be verified. I mean, quite frankly, at any crime scene, unless it was completely scrubbed down right before the crime happened, you're always going to have multiple DNA sources, multiple DNA found at any scene, whether it's a car or a house. And apparently, this may have been a party house too, with a lot of people going in and out. So, really, the fact that there's multiple DNA here, that's not really surprising to me, because that's really the reality of it. It's not like CSI where they found one hair by the suspect and there's nothing else at the scene. No, it's always a mixed bag at every scene.
Yeah, and this house was a party house. I mean, we've seen the body camera footage. I mean, this is a house where kids were in and out all of the time. Multiple kids, whether it was women, men, what have you, a lot of people in and out. Plus, that glove that was found outside the crime scene, we've heard a lot of talk about that over the many months, people speculating that could have been the killer leaving a glove behind, what have you. This house, yeah, exactly. A lot of people have kind of likened it to that. But what I find interesting, though, is this house was a petri dish. It's literally a petri dish of DNA, and you find 3 profiles, one outside the house, 2 inside, that you decide to run through CODIS. So to me, I'm thinking those DNA, and you find 3 profiles, one outside the house, 2 inside, that you decide to run through CODIS. So to me, I'm thinking those had to be profiles that they couldn't eliminate as belonging to other people who had been in the house, and that they were thinking might be leading them to a suspect. Am I wrong?
Well, again, it's a mixed bag. It could be it could be anybody, and again, they can't just rely on a DNA hit. They're going to have to look at who are these people, where could they have been during the time of the murder. They can't just say aha DNA and not look at anything else. But yeah, that just goes to my point that any crime scene is going to be a mixed bag of DNA, and it doesn't really tell you when the DNA was left there. It just tells you it was left there in some way, shape, or form.
Another
Welcome back to my Mental Health and Crime channel. My name is Huda London. This is the case of the Idaho quadruple murders that took place almost a year ago on the 13th of November 2022. This interview was done by Law and Crime 4.5 months ago, and I do agree with the lawyer and the reporter that there's a lot of mixed DNA in this house. It was a party house, so unfortunately, I'm sure over hundreds of people used to come in and out of the house. We've seen it at least on 4 body cam videos of the police, and then we had the undercover police in Taylor Road. But I believe the 3 male unidentified DNAs are really important. They're crucial. Because who are they? How did they come to this house? Was it a previous DNA left from a party or some other day that somebody slept over? Or was it the killer himself? I believe that some people were ruled out too early. We know that Jack D was ruled out the last.